All right, good afternoon, everybody. I said good afternoon, everybody. All right, my name is Sudip Parikh, and I have the privilege of serving as the Chief Executive Officer of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS. And it is awesome to see you all here this afternoon. I hope you've all had a rewarding day, full of meetings, being in scientific sessions, having networking opportunities, or simply bumping into the friends and colleagues who you've missed for a year. And as we think about that, and as we appreciate that, I hope we'll also take a moment to again acknowledge our partners and supporters who've made it possible for us to gather here this afternoon in such splendor. So let me do that now. So the first of those is Arizona State University, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, CURE, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, the University of Colorado at Boulder, the Georgia Tech School of Public Policy, Florida International University, the U.S. Department of Energy Office of Science, Amgen, the Nanyang Technological University of Singapore, IBM, Smart Simple Software, the George Washington University, Fulbright, the University of Chicago Press, and Cambridge University Press. Again, please join me in thanking each of these organizations, many of whom have been longtime partners of the AAAS, for their support of this year's annual meeting. It does make the meeting much better. Thank you. All right, so now that you've had that full day of sessions and meetings and networking, we've got a real treat in store for you to round things out. And we're going to hear from some outstanding leaders and scholars in an increasingly important and urgent area, the impacts of global warming and climate change on human health. Now, if you're going to have a discussion like that, you need a great moderator. You need a moderator who has seen a lot of things. And so it is my distinct pleasure to introduce my colleague and the moderator of today's discussion, Dr. Meredith Wadman. Now, Dr. Wadman, not yet. No, I got more things to say. Dr. Wadman is a senior correspondent for Science Magazine's award-winning news team. Now, I want to talk to you about the news team for a second at Science, and I want to be a little serious for just a second. You know, when this meeting 30 years ago happened, there were a lot more science journalists in the world, a lot more science journalists, and there were a lot more news teams that had divisions that were dedicated to covering science. And that has changed. That has changed. And there are not enough anymore. And the number of those news teams, the number of those reporters, the number of journalists who have the experience to be able to dig deeply into matters of science is dwindling. And so I am proud that the news from Science, that Science Magazine, has been able to maintain and even grow our team of science journalists. It is they are actually a treasure that help both explain and articulate what is happening in the sciences and also hold us accountable as a scientific enterprise. So I wanted to say that before I bring up Dr. Wadman. Now, as I said, Dr. Wadman is a senior correspondent for Science Magazine's team. She's trained as a physician. She's covered biomedical research and its politics from Washington, D.C. for nearly 30 years. Prior to joining Science, Meredith was a staff writer for Nature. All right, we've forgiven her for that. And a contributing correspondent for Fortune magazine. She's also written for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. She's the author of the critically acclaimed book, The Vaccine Race, Science, Politics, and the Human Cost of Defeating Disease, which was published by Viking in 2017. 2017, not 2020. Meredith completed her undergraduate studies in human biology at Stanford and completed her medical degree as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. She also holds a master's degree from the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. So now, please join me in welcoming Meredith Wadman, who's going to introduce today's panel.
Thanks, Sudip, and thanks to all of you for being here for this so important discussion about a critical issue of our time. I want to quickly thank one more group that's been really important, which is the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, because it was their generous funding of our reporters' travel that allowed the production of this really great package of articles that we put out last September and on which this forum is based. They funded that, and they've also funded the travel to this room of the expert panelists that you're just about to hear. The next 75 minutes, or it's less now because we got a late start, but what we're going to do is I will introduce each panelist very briefly. They will give about 5 minutes on their current work, and then we're going to engage in a moderated discussion, which will include our two remote panelists who are zooming in from the Gambia and Mumbai, where it's either very late or very early. So we're very grateful about that, and I'll introduce them in a second. After the moderated discussion, we'll have questions from the audience, and the microphones for those questions are in the middle aisle, just toward the front of the first and the second section, if you'd like to pose a question. So without further ado, our first panelist is Anna Bonell. She's a clinician and epidemiologist at the Medical Research Unit, the Gambia, at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She's on the left in the yellow dress. And she is studying the biological impacts of extreme heat on pregnant women and newborns. Next, after Anna, will be Adelaide Lusambili, who's joining us in person. Come on up, Adelaide. She is a medical anthropologist at Africa International University in Nairobi, and she too is investigating the impact of heat on pregnant women and newborns in rural Kilifi County, Kenya, as part of CHAMNA, which is a big international study of the impacts of heat on pregnant women and neonates. Following Adelaide, Erin Mordecai will present. She is an infectious disease ecologist at Stanford University, and she uses modeling to study the impact of climate change on vector-borne diseases. After Erin will come Jason Glaser, who's also here with us in person. He is the CEO of La Isla, which is an La Isla Network, which is an occupational health research organization that develops interventions to help laborers in the Americas who are exposed to extreme heat, and that is now extending its work to South Asia and the Middle East. These workers suffer inordinate rates of chronic kidney disease, even at very young ages, due to their heat exposures. Last but certainly not least, joining us from Mumbai is Vaishnavi Chandrashekhar. She is a freelance journalist in Mumbai. She recently won the high honor of an Eric and Wendy Schmidt / National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine Award for Excellence in Science Communication. Her work has appeared in The Atlantic, The Guardian, The New York Times, The Times of India, and many other outlets. She wrote a piece in this section, which, by the way, if you didn't see it coming in, you can pick up this off-print at a table in the back, about how India is becoming a laboratory for urban heat mitigation, especially among the poorly resourced. So let's go on. Anna Bonell of the MRC unit, the Gambia, you're first up. Let's hear your presentation.
Thank you, Meredith. It's a great privilege for me to be here today, phoning in from the Gambia, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm going to speak about our work, which has been looking at the impacts of extreme heat in pregnancy, with particular focus on our results from the Gambia in West Africa. Next slide, please. So the IPCC demonstrates again and again the impacts of climate change, and this image gives you the indication that a child born today is affected by climate change, but the decisions that we make in this year and years ahead will really affect how much impacted they are by climate change. Next slide, please. And when I talk about the impacts of climate change, we know from a whole wealth of literature that has come out in recent years that mothers exposed to extreme heat have a whole host of problems, not only for them, but also for their unborn children. And it increases the risk of preterm birth, low birth weight, and stillbirth. Next slide, please. And although those results were from a study that was getting the evidence rates, it's important to remember that over half the population live in tropical and subtropical regions, and these are the areas where they see more extreme weather events, where there is less options in terms of avoidance of the heat, where socioeconomic factors increase their vulnerability, and there's less climate resilience within both the food system and also within the health systems in these areas. Next slide, please. So I will just present very briefly a few results from West Africa, the Gambia, as an example of what we're seeing now in terms of what heat is doing to pregnant women. So this is a study that we ran in 2019 and 20, and we found that pregnant women in the Gambia are exposed to at least moderate heat stress, if not above, for every single day that we monitored them whilst they were doing their activities of daily living, including subsistence farming and providing food for the family. Next slide, please. And when we looked at how that impacted on the mothers, we saw this significant increase in both the mother's skin temperature and their core temperature, and an increase in their physiological strain related to this. Next slide, please. And when we then also looked at the baby, we found this very clear relationship between the heat stress exposure and the fetal heart rate, with an increase in fetal heart rate with the increasing heat exposure. Next slide, please. And when we went on to look at evidence of fetal strain, so evidence that the placenta was maybe not functioning as well as it could, or that the heart rate was dangerously high or low, we found this clear link between the heat stress exposure and fetal strain. Next slide, please. And some further work that we've done using historical cohort data, we found again that when pregnant women were exposed to high levels of heat, this affected the growth of the baby. And this is particularly important in the first trimester. So if women are exposed to high temperatures in the first trimester, we found that at birth, the baby was smaller in terms of smaller weight for gestational age and smaller head circumference for gestational age, with all the implications of that going forward. Next slide, please. And interestingly, it's not only a problem that occurs in utero, but also later we found that we looked at the infants, so we looked from 0 to 2 years, and again we found this clear link with heat stress exposure and a reduced weight for height, so increased risk of wasting and being too thin. Next slide, please. And I very briefly wanted to end on a slightly more positive note than it all being doom and gloom. So following on from our work here, we've also done some youth engagement activities where we engaged schools across the Gambia to ask them what climate impacts they were affected by and what solutions they would like to see enacted. And we found a very strong engagement from the youth and a very clear wish to change the current trajectory. Next slide, please. And so we took one of their solutions that they presented to try and reduce their climate impacts, which was to change to using solar cookers. And we took this forward and we presented it to women leaders within the communities, again, across the Gambia. And again, we found this very strong commitment in a desire and wish to change their current practices and to reduce the harmful impacts to the environment from their practices themselves. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anna. Next is Adelaide Lusambili of Africa International University in Nairobi. She's a medical anthropologist.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me. Today I have a pleasure to discuss some of the research findings from the CHAMNA Consortium. CHAMNA Consortium represents Climate, Heat, and Maternal Neonatal Health Africa. It is a transdisciplinary consortium made up of partners from the United States, Europe, and sub-Saharan Africa. As you can see, those are all the partners. It's an international consortium. So the study we are talking about was conducted in rural Kenya on the east coast of Africa and in West Africa in Burkina Faso. So what we did in our research, we were mapping the impact of extreme heat on moms during pregnancy, postpartum, and on their neonates in rural Africa. So what we found was that, So what we did, we interviewed pregnant women, postpartum women, their support networks, and a range of stakeholders in two dissimilar settings in Kenya and Burkina Faso to understand how heat is impacting moms on their journey to delivery, to pregnancy, childbirth, and delivery. So the key findings we found out both in West Africa and in Kenya was that, first of all, heat has a harmful impact on moms, on their pathway to delivery and on their newborns. The first key thing we found was that period of extreme heat, women compromised behaviors. For instance, in rural Africa, which is rampant with mosquitoes, women were unlikely to use bed nets and also to attend antenatal care and form relationships during pregnancy because they feared walking in the heat. In addition to that, we did find that during extreme heat, women were not willing to attend healthcare facilities for delivery, and they therefore preferred to give birth in the homes. And these had repercussions because it led to increased newborn mortalities, and most of the moms from the community perception were reported to die during birth. In addition to that, there were reports of increased maternal anxiety and distress during labor and childbirth, and this was caused by the direct effect of heat on the ecological system, where we had depleted water and agricultural impact as a result of heat exposure and extended period of drought. So with this, women reported feeling increased anxiety, elevated body temperatures, and extremely exhausted to the extent that most of them talked about disrupted sleep and inability to perform activities of their daily activities. So in a nutshell, what happened was that during birth, heat continued to impact moms. Moms complained that moms in healthcare reported that at birth, most women had miscarriage because by the time they reached the health facilities, they were dehydrated and were unable to push their babies. So most of the time, the babies ended up dying, or some of the moms also ended up dying. So heat continued to impact them in a big way. And then it continued up to during postpartum. Postpartum period heat, extreme heat, had a deleterious impact because moms complained of extended period of bleeding, and most of them also complained of having suicidal feelings. But for the care of the baby, that's where the mom reported a more harmful impact. For instance, most of the babies were born low birth weight, and moms reported that because of that, they needed skin-to-skin care, that's the kangaroo mother care, which was not possible at this point. And most of the children we observed that were born during extreme heat were born with blisters on the head, in the mouth, and in the skin, and it was not possible for them to breastfeed. Bonding was impossible because of discomfort caused by the heat, and also exclusive breastfeeding was not possible. And in a nutshell, moms reported not being able to walk in the heat to take the children to postnatal care. So all these intersected with other factors. For instance, the built environment where most of the women live in rural Africa is unventilated, and this actually amplified the burden of heat on moms and their babies. So what we did after our research, we used a system approach to co-design with community members to come up with contextually accepted interventions. And we work with the community using a system approach to find out what are the key priority interventions. And one of the things we piloted out was a behavior change interventions, where we educated the whole community to come up with interventions to reduce the impact of heat exposure on women and their newborns. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I just wanted to bring you along so that I'd like to hear more about the interventions in the discussion section. All right, next up, Erin Mordecai of Stanford University, an infectious disease ecologist.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, and thank you to NSF, NIH, and Stanford that have funded the work that I'm going to share today, as well as our many collaborators that have made this work possible. Today, I want to talk to you a little bit about how the impacts of climate and global change impact infectious diseases. So far, we've heard about the impacts of chronic heat exposure to pregnant women. Climate change and heat waves are not the only part of anthropogenic change that are important. Humans are rapidly changing the planet in many different dimensions, including the composition of landscapes and ecosystems, moving species and ourselves around the world, and driving other species extinct. And all of these human activities are affecting both the health of humans and the health of ecosystems. One of the key examples of these types of changes are changes in vector-borne diseases, or pathogens that are transmitted by biting arthropods like mosquitoes or ticks. The reason that these are such an important case study is because, first of all, these include some of the highest burden diseases in the world, like malaria and dengue, yellow fever, West Nile, and many others. And also because these pathogens are wrapped up in the life cycle of an ectotherm mosquito or tick. So that mosquito or tick that's transmitting the pathogen is exquisitely linked to the conditions of the environment around it. So we can imagine how climate change and other aspects of environmental change might impact these pathogens through its effects on the life cycle of the vector. If we dive into the life cycle of a mosquito, we can start out with the adult female laying eggs on the side of a body of water. Those eggs have to then hatch, go through 4 larval developmental stages, pupate, and then emerge as adults. And every stage of that life cycle is dependent on temperature, because this is an ectotherm. The part of the life cycle that mosquitoes are most famous for, of course, is the fact that they bite vertebrate hosts for a blood meal. And the rate of blood feeding is also dependent on the environmental temperature. And then the parasite, for its part, has hijacked this mosquito life cycle so that when it gets picked up in a blood meal, instead of getting digested and excreted out of the body, it instead is able to break through the mosquito's midgut barrier, disseminate throughout the body, and eventually bind to the salivary glands, where it gets injected into that next host. And again, that process is temperature sensitive. So we can see already, looking across this life cycle, how complex the transmission process is and how sensitive it is to temperature. And from ectotherm biology, we know that these temperature effects on life history traits of ectotherms are almost always nonlinear. So we see these hump-shaped relationships between development rates and survival and temperature. And this is what we expect for mosquitoes as well. So when we study the impacts of temperature on different mosquito-borne diseases, we find, not surprisingly, that there's a hump-shaped relationship, or a nonlinear relationship, where temperature optimizes transmission of these diseases between around 25 and 29 degrees Celsius. And for both very low and very high temperatures, disease transmission begins to slow down and eventually stop, because either the mosquito can't complete the incubation cycle of the parasite, or the mosquito dies too quickly to complete that incubation cycle. But importantly, although there is this broad physiological consistency across different mosquito vectors, there's also differences. So we see that diseases like dengue and Zika have some of the warmest thermal optimum temperatures, around 29 degrees Celsius or 84 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas malaria peaks around 25 degrees Celsius or 78 degrees Fahrenheit, and some other pathogens have even cooler thermal optima. So what this means in the context of climate change is that in some contexts, we'll see climate warming increasing the potential for vector-borne disease transmission. We've seen this a lot in Nepal and other highland areas around the world. In other contexts, we may actually see climate warming decrease the potential for certain diseases, but we can also see that the impact of climate on different diseases will differ. So to focus in on one of the most kind of important climate-sensitive diseases that we expect to be changing with climate warming, we can look at what's happening with dengue. Dengue is one of the highest burden mosquito-borne diseases. It's estimated to cause between 60 and 100 million symptomatic cases per year of a severe febrile illness, and it's distributed throughout most of the tropics and subtropics of the world. And when we look at the current distribution of dengue, we can do some modeling to estimate the impact that anthropogenic climate change has already had on dengue transmission. And what we find using causal inference methods is that about 18% of the current global dengue burden is attributable to climate change that has already happened, suggesting that climate change is already having a very large impact on a very severe and important disease burden in humans. And you can see if you look at this map that this burden is not equally distributed, and in some places 45% or more of the current dengue burden is due to climate warming that's already happened, particularly in places like southern Brazil and highland parts of Latin America, where the temperature is just warming into that optimal range. Looking forward to the future, by mid-century, depending on the emission scenario, we project between 40 and 57% increases globally in dengue transmission by mid-century. And these increases are even larger in, again, some of these highland and more southern places that currently have cooler temperatures. So we could see a tripling or more of dengue risk in some regions. And what I'm showing in the circles on this map are the major population centers. And what you'll notice is that a lot of these occur in places where those largest increases in dengue are projected to occur. And that's because these are some of the more comfortable places to live where temperatures aren't currently too warm. So this presents a really important potential impact and actually impact that's already happening of climate warming on dengue transmission as just one example of the types of impacts that climate change is going to have on infectious diseases. And to conclude, I want to emphasize that it's not just climate. There's lots of other aspects of anthropogenic or human-driven change, such as land use change, pollution, and other types of ecological disruption that are driving changes in infectious disease dynamics that we should really be concerned about going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Erin. Jason Glaser, the CEO of Lusambili Network.
Get the mic set up and
Sorry.
let everybody know I've had dengue, and I'm glad somebody's working on it because it's not a fun disease. I want to thank everybody for being here. I know it's late on a Friday night, and thanks for science and for the Peel Oyster Center for getting this together. I'm just going to jump in so we can get to the conversation. So my organization works with people who have the toughest jobs in the world: gold miners, sugarcane cutters, construction laborers. I was a young filmmaker when I stumbled on a situation of sugarcane cutters in Nicaragua that were working at extreme rates, core body temperature up to 39, 40 degrees, 6 to 7 days a week. Now we find out some work 9 months a year. Duration, intensity, frequency of their exposure of heat stress is higher than most groups, and they became a sentinel population for kidney disease. Now, I'm not going to get into the disagreements of chronic kidney disease, of unknown cause and the different etiologies, but there's very clearly in this population an association with heat stress and repeated acute kidney injury, or AKI, you'll hear me say again, due to that exposure of heat stress, and subsequent chronic kidney disease. And that's really nothing new. I mean, the US military has known about this for a long time. That's where a lot of heat stress mitigations come from. And there's also a lot of important information that emerged from, unfortunately, under apartheid out of South African mining companies, understood that this was a risk. So we stumbled on it kind of as people transitioned from working on farms to becoming laborers, which is a very different organization of work. And heat stress is a real problem because it's not just the environment, but it's what you're doing in that environment. And cane cutters became a sentinel population because, as you saw, the workload is so strong. And it's not just kidney disease. There's early mortality due to outright heat stroke. There's increased accident risk. You're more out of touch. You're going to cut your hand. You're going to trip. You're going to fall off scaffolding. You saw that a lot in Qatar. The data supports that. And it's really bad for production as well. So if you look at Mesoamerica and this kind of sentinel population, on several levels, we kind of got clues that there was a need to act. So we saw a very high incidence in population-based epidemiological studies among sugarcane cutters, brick makers, kiln workers, gold miners, and construction workers, but very few incidents among subsistence farmers who can control their workday. Their work is not, they're not laborers. We saw in studies that we did on the occupational setting that between supervisors and cane cutters in the fields, there was a 12-to-1 risk ratio between those with very high workload and core temperature and low. for outcomes of kidney disease and kidney injury. We saw it being the leading cause of death among young men after high-impact lead poisoning or gunplay in El Salvador. And then we're seeing support in the lab as well. I do want to touch on the fact that this goes far beyond the occupational setting. The impact on development and society is multi-generational. Development banks keep funneling money into large industry in the region with the idea of more jobs means more progress, but this is a problem when 22% of kids are replacing their dead parents in the field. And as you can see, I think there's a long way to go on treatment in these populations. I think Baxter probably knows better than that's probably not the way to provide peritoneal dialysis. So there's a lot to do. So keeping in mind that there's a lot to do, one thing we focused on in the occupational setting is lowering that core temperature. We do a lot more than that, but it's a fundamental thing. It's what I'm going to touch on today. So we developed that through a multidisciplinary approach, transdisciplinary approach of prevention for the disease, for the injury, resilience for the local economy and actually the industry itself, efficiency for the workers, and then using that data to inform policy both back home and abroad. So this is really obvious, but it's pretty funny. Like, you know, we all get on our channels and our canals and our research, and obviously good design is part of the problem or part of the solution to a problem. So you can see here where there's no intervention, very bad outcomes on time under stress and kidney injury. We introduce the intervention. Oh, look, we drop it by, I think, 72, 80%, down to 6% of kidney injury over the harvest. Very exciting. But we're not quite satisfied, so we introduce more breaks to keep that core temperature down even further, but it levels off. What's going on? Are we wrong? We introduce an organizational management system with our team, and we get some really great results. So just to keep in mind, this transdisciplinary approach is really important. It's certainly not just the design, but also the implementation. One thing that we're really excited about is we've really reduced that acute kidney injury incidence. We basically have eliminated it, even in the most dangerous parts of the workforce. And everybody's thinking, that's great. So you've introduced about 24% of the workday, cut their workday in half. How can this possibly be viable? And I don't think we have all the answers for that. Some of our physiology team had some great ideas about it. It's like when you do HIIT training, you recover, you hit, you recover, you hit, or you could slog it out for 12 hours straight. So we have a lot more to understand about why, but the findings are pretty shocking. So we've cut the active work hours in half. I frankly was hoping for a net zero, so nobody can complain about the intervention, but we gained. Productivity goes up by hour and by day from when there were no workplace improvements, when the company tried their own and we introduced our system, we've actually increased productivity in this group by 10 to 20%. We've also provided a 22% ROI to the employer. And, you know, it's great. We've had this success in Nicaragua. It's now expanding throughout Central America and Mexico. Long way to go. But what has bothered us is we're seeing very similar narratives emerge of Nepali workers who go off healthy. They're screened for kidney disease. That means the employers know this is a problem in the Gulf and Malaysia, just like they used to screen and still do screen for kidney disease before it was recognized as a cause among the sugarcane plantations. It's kind of a bad repeat, a bad memory happening again. And we see these very similar narratives emerge. Thankfully, we've got some funding from the Department of State to start digging into this and support those migrant communities with our colleagues in Nepal. Back home, it's a reality. It's coming for us. I don't want to be alarmist, but it's a major issue. Every summer, we see more and more heat stroke, more and more acute kidney injury. There's a lack of follow-up. We've got a pilot going with Turner Construction. And then even in an industry where the workload isn't that tough, but where they're not acclimatized, and when there's late heat waves, we saw 6 grape pickers die in Champagne and Bordeaux. So this is real. This is coming. But what I want to say is thank you to all of you, and thanks for our team. And I'm going to be quiet now so we can get to talking to each other.
Actually, we've got one more panelist.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Vaishnavi Chandrashekhar is joining us from Mumbai, where the sun is just coming up, I'm sure. Welcome, Vaishnavi.
Meredith, and thank you for having me here. I am a science and environment journalist based in Mumbai, and I spent a chunk of last year doing some reporting for Science, funded by the Pulitzer Center, And I went to 3 cities to look at how cities are understanding increasing heat waves and what they're doing to mitigate or adapt to that. I went to Delhi and Nagpur, and we do see that heat waves in India are increasing in frequency and intensity. And especially cities are a concern because India is urbanizing, and we expect in the next couple of decades more than 50% of the population will be living in cities. And cities themselves generate heat because of the buildings and the concrete and the tar. I think there was a study last month that showed that annual night temperatures in 20 cities in India have increased since 2000 by as much as 2 degrees Celsius due to the urban heat island effect, which is the effect of urbanization increasing temperatures. Next slide, please. So from a research perspective, no one has really done more work on urban heat in India as Professor Rajeshri Kotarkar. She is a professor of architecture and urban planning in the Visvesvaraya National Institute of Technology in Nagpur, which is a large town of about 3 million in the very center of India, and actually one of the hottest cities in India. And here you see her in a traditional house in Nagpur, built in the 1700s. And Professor Kotarkar's work actually started by looking at how traditional architecture and traditional housing was built for the local environment and the local climate before there was electricity and air conditioners and fans. And when this picture was taken, the temperature outside was actually about 102 degrees Fahrenheit, 39 degrees, but you definitely didn't feel it inside because the features of this building are built to increase airflow and reduce temperatures. Next slide, please. So Dr. Kotarkar's team is not concerned with the individual building, but the city. And for the past few years, what she and her team have been doing is trying to understand how urban heat works in the most comprehensive way possible. So a big foundation of their work is that they placed sensors across the city of Nagpur, and they divided up the city into sort of different land uses of, moderately built up open land and sort of gathered data on how heat varies across this built form. And they really have been trying to understand how built form shapes heat in the city. And of course, one of the things they've understood is that Indian cities are much more heterogeneous than cities you might find in Europe or America. And so, small changes in built form do make a huge difference. But they've also been doing other kinds of studies. Another kind of study that they've been doing is vulnerability mapping. So the map here, I should explain the map here that you're looking at actually shows heat index across the city, which is a combination of temperature and humidity. And how that varies across different built forms. But they've also done similar work looking at vulnerability of different areas in the city, where they look at socioeconomic factors like if an area has a larger poorer population or doesn't have such good services such as water or shelter, then those areas are more vulnerable. And so they've also been looking at the socioeconomic aspect of heat vulnerability in the city. And they've also been looking at perceptions of heat. So a really interesting study that they did, which I don't think has been done in India anywhere before, is that in the middle of the heat wave in 2022, they went out and they measured temperature and humidity and other meteorological parameters, but they also interviewed passing pedestrians and asked them about their experience and sort of trying to understand how perception of heat matches up with objective measurements. And one of the really important takeaways from that was that people who live in very hot regions, because central India is a very hot region, often don't perceive that heat is a risk because they're so habituated to it. And that has implications, especially in a future of increasing heat. Next slide, please. So all this research that Professor Kotarkar has done, luckily, it's not just for scientific publications, but it's being used in a policy document for the federal government. She is drafting the National Heat Action Plan, or a model National Heat Action Plan for the federal agencies. What is a heat action plan? A heat action plan is probably the main tool by which local governments are increasingly looking at how to cope with heat in India. There are already about 30 cities that have heat action plans, and there are dozens more in the pipeline, and some of them will sort of be taking their template from this model plan that Dr. Patharkar has created. And at a very basic level, the plan sort of prepares local government um, to know when to declare a heat alert, to prepare infrastructure for heat waves, such as setting aside beds in hospitals, putting out publication material, and sort of also, sort of policy intervention, sort of restricting school hours and things like that. This is there has been some analysis of these plans, and they're not always effective. Many of them do remain on paper; they're not implemented, they're not funded adequately. But they are in place, and they are an increasing emphasis for both federal agencies and other state governments and local governments. Next slide, please. There are many other initiatives as well. This initiative that you're seeing here is an effort to retrofit sort of fairly low-income housing with the roofs with technology that should reduce temperatures within. And what you see here is a woman painting the roof of her home with this solar reflective white paint. And this particular kind of initiative is becoming increasingly popular in the country because it's been shown to sort of reduce temperatures by at least like 1 degree within the home, more if other retrofits are used. And one of the experiments that are happening in a number of cities is to look at these low-cost retrofits and technologies, because cities in India are full of poorer people who can't afford air conditioners, who can't afford, maybe better housing, and so need to rely on cheaper and affordable alternatives to cool temperatures down. There are a number of other initiatives, but I think I'll stop there, Meredith, and I can talk more about them later.
Thanks, Vaishnavi. So thanks to all of you for these excellent presentations. I'm sorry to say we've lost Anna. Do our AV folks have any idea if that's something that's solvable technically, or did she need to go to bed, or anyone? If there's a way to sort, there she is. Oh, good. Okay, excellent. Well, I had my questions in alphabetical order, so I was going to launch in with you, Anna. Let me just remind myself here. Talk to me about your current project. You did this work in the pregnant subsistence farmers. Now you've got some new welcome funding, and what are you doing with it? What's the goal, and what do you hope to learn?
Yeah, thanks, Meredith. So we have funding to kind of expand much more on understanding the biological pathways and the mechanisms that underlie this association between heat and adverse pregnancy outcomes. So we are recruiting a pregnancy cohort where we will utilize the heat gradient that is experienced in the Gambia. So in inland Gambia, it's much more like the Sahara. It's very dry and very hot. And at the coast, you have the cooler kind of conditions from the sea. So we will recruit 2 different cohorts. We will look at the impacts of heat on both the mother, the placenta, and the fetus. And the idea is to try to unpick in a lot more detail what's actually going on. So are there changes that are happening in the first trimester to the way in which the genes are being expressed and the way in which proteins are being manifest? And is that something that is then carried forward and increasing the risk for the fetus, not only in terms of the fetal outcome, but then also in terms of like chronic disease later in life? Will be one aspect of the project. And then we'll also explore in much more detail the sort of findings that we found in our pilot study around the role of the placenta, placental blood flow, this diversion of blood flow away from the internal organs to the skin to help keep people cool during their extreme heat events, with the idea that this this data can then be used to help inform effective and evidence-based interventions.
All right. Do you guys feel like there should be, do we need to wait and understand the biology? Sometimes I just feel like just get these women out of the heat. Of course, if it was easy, it would be done. What can we do practically, or what do you see on the ground practically in the Gambia right now that doesn't need to wait for understanding the biology?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of basic behavioral changes that can be put into place in terms of kind of adjusting scheduling. But when we did some similar work to what Adelaide did, we found that actually there was constraints on women's time. So because there's so much pressure on women in terms of the sort of cultural and commitments to the family, that actually changing the schedule and when they go to the farm and work, it's not as simple as saying, yes, just go at a different time, because they have to provide, they have to cook, they have to be there to provide food for the family, and they have to clean the compounds as well. So it's more complicated than just saying, okay, just change your schedule, that will be easy for you. And so I think us coming in and saying, do this, do this, do this is not the way forward. So we are also spending time during this program to co-design interventions that would make sense on the ground for the communities here.
Do you have one, for instance, like was the solar oven, was that an example?
Yeah, solar oven. This was actually from the school children. This was one of their sort of solutions. I think kind of putting together what Erin was also talking about, it's not only about climate change, especially here in the Gambia, we see like a massive change in land use, huge degradation of the environment, and actually a big problem with waste as well. And so for the children, the problems for them was really the use of firewood in terms of cooking. And so they were coming up with solutions around reducing the need to chop wood down, and then sort of, I guess the heat component would be that you would have some nature-based solutions, sort of protection from the trees. But yeah, so then we went ahead and did some local designed solar cookers, which also had their challenges, but there was a real interest in this as an alternative.
Yes, please, Erin.
I think there's a really interesting and important connection between infrastructure and kind of social structures in general, and the ability to make individual behavioral decisions that affect health and affect someone's ability to be able to persist in a heat wave, for example. But it's also really closely related to conservation, as Anna was just saying. Places that have trees, places where nature has been protected and where there's access to clean water and shade can be much more healthy spaces. And the lack of access to nearby healthcare can be a really big barrier, as well, as some of the other presenters have mentioned. So I think there's both local behavioral interventions, but there's also much more important, larger structural and infrastructure investments that need to be made.
Yeah.
Because I really like that original question, because I mean, it's really what we focus on. Like, do you need to prove the biology of the damage and the stress to make common sense interventions? And I think, the easy answer you would think would be no. And my organization very much focuses on risk mitigation. But the reality is you're trying to change policy. And Anna, It's a Very Small World, works with the same physiologists we work with in our work in Europe. And, for him to start changing the policies in the EU, which we think of as more progressive, he needed that biological data to go to and to point at. And for us, when we had the very Sisyphus-like work to get a large, giant aggregate industry that has always been in charge, the most powerful families in each of these countries, you can't ignore those dynamics, you had to prove what was going on as far as mortality, as far as organ damage, as far as long-term outcome. The one thing that I think is you should do both at once. Common sense interventions that you know are not going to cause harm, water, rest, shade, mitigating heat stress, should be pursued at the same time if and when possible. Last thing I want to say is I really encourage all of our teams to have that labor economist and look at the cost to the healthcare system, to the employer, and to the worker, because that's what moves policy really quickly. A disease like kidney disease is so expensive. Emergency services for women in neonatal situations, that's an unneeded cost to a public health system that's already overstretched, especially like dialysis is unbelievably expensive. So if you can show that prevention is cheaper, faster, it helps move, a beneficial feedback loop to move the biological understanding forward, to improve preventions, but providing relief, frankly, to the individual, to the state level.
Right.
Yeah, I thought it was a great question. Yeah.
I want to come back and ask something more about the productivity stuff you talked about. But Adelaide, talk about what you're doing now in Kalifi County. Did it arise from your recent work, and what exactly are you trying to accomplish?
Yeah, so first of all, let me just build on what Dr. Ann was talking about on behavioral changes, because I know it's important to continue to do research to understand the biological impact of, the heat's biological impact. But in the settings where Ann works and where I work in Kilifi, like Africa, heat has been normalized because communities have experienced heat for many decades, because it's the tropics anyway, and this extended period of drought. So they really don't understand the heat effect. They don't see heat as harmful because they've been experiencing high temperatures. And so knowledge around heat is really, heat risks, health risks is really, really important. And that's one of the things we've been trying to do, to begin to shift some of the social, cultural, behavioral practices that can be very harmful during high temperatures. But also one of the things we are trying to bring together is the fact that in these settings, information on the heat risks, like early weather warning systems, exist in silos, and the impact of heat stress also exists in silos. So we are trying to merge these together so that they can work together, begin to work together. But beside that, we've been just funded to do some work, to do some measurements on humidity and high temperatures in different homes so that we can identify houses that are conducive for maternal health outcomes, because the homes are very dangerous where women live. Most of them are unventilated. Yeah.
You talked when I was reporting the article on heat and pregnancy about some of the social expectations of women in Kilifi County, and Anna mentioned, shifting working hours.
Yeah.
What did you hear from that community about openness to somehow restructuring systems to protect women at certain times of pregnancy or at certain times of day, or to have the man go get the water? That's probably sacrilege. But do you know what I'm saying? Like, was there openness, and how did you feel that out?
Not really, because there are roles, daily chores, activities of daily living that are feminized. Whether you are pregnant or you've just given birth, the activities you must continue to do as a woman. And this is really dangerous. And that's some of the social behavioral practices we are trying to change by bringing the community together to begin to support women in pregnancy and immediately after birth. But it's not, it's a behavior change, and behavior change does not take short time, it takes a long time. And it's really difficult to change these behaviors. It requires a lot of knowledge, education, and sensitization of the whole community, using key influencers to work with the community so that they can begin to shift some of these behaviors and support women in periods of pregnancy. Yeah.
Erin, your one graph showed that malaria, in its most dangerous form in Africa, when it's married with a particular mosquito vector, particular malaria species, really didn't like it too much when it got above 25 degrees centigrade. And so how do you go about communicating subtleties like that to a general audience? Do you have occasion to? So that people don't say, oh, good, well, malaria is not going to be a problem because the mosquitoes are going to die off because it's going to be too hot. I mean, it's so complicated.
Yeah.
How do you approach trying to get a subtle and yet impactful and probably alarming climate message out there.
That was one of my biggest fears when we first published that work when I was a graduate student, that someone would come up and say, oh, great, that means climate change is going to eliminate malaria. No, that's not happening.
Yeah.
That's not what's happening at all. And in fact, there's so many different dynamics going on that on one hand, gradual climate warming is not necessarily making malaria worse in a lot of the endemic places that are already very warm, as you mentioned. But what we're seeing in some places like in Kenya is that the rainy cycle, the seasonal rains are really being disrupted by climate change. And so what used to be a single kind of very seasonal peak in malaria is now starting to spread out, and you see malaria cases throughout the year. And that really changes the clinical approach and the epidemiological and vector control approach. You're also starting to see malaria encroaching into, highland areas, parts of Kenya and other parts of the world that were too cool for malaria to be transmitted. We're now starting to see malaria in places like Nepal, in highland Nepal for the first time, and in parts of southern Africa. It's also so closely linked to land use changes. Like in South America, we see a lot of deforestation being linked, and illegal gold mining and other types of kind of forest destruction being linked to malaria transmission. So malaria is very stubborn. It's not going away. It's a highly adaptable parasite and a highly adaptable mosquito, even if the direction of temperature change isn't always making it worse everywhere. Now, there are temperatures that are so hot that malaria just cannot be transmitted, but humans don't want to be living at those temperatures either. So I think there are some pathogens where there's a more straightforward case. I think dengue is a good example because that thermal optimum is so warm. Most places are seeing temperatures warming into higher suitability for dengue transmission. And in a lot of places, we really can attribute a lot of the dengue burden to warming that's happening. There was a really good attribution study conducted recently in sub-Saharan Africa on malaria, and they showed that even though this relationship is nonlinear and it's increasing in some places and decreasing in others, the net effect of anthropogenic climate change is that we are seeing hundreds of thousands of more cases of malaria than we would have seen previously, and many more children dying of malaria than we would have seen if there hadn't been anthropogenic warming. So I'm not sure what the best communication strategy is. Maybe as a journalist you have a better handle on that than I do, but I think just talking through the dimensions of how these diseases are transmitted and the ways that they're affected by interconnected processes in nature, and that humans are not disconnected from climate change or from nature, that we experience the changes, we experience the positives and negatives of the changes that we make in the environment.
Did you want to piggyback on that?
Short, but I think you don't want to be an alarmist, but Upton Sinclair writes this socialist utopia book, The Jungle. But what do people care about? The 15 pages that talk about the food that was going to make them sick and how disgusting it was. That wasn't his intent. He went to bed, went to his grave pretty upset about that. And I used to start my slide with how much money's been dedicated to Ebola, even though it's only killed 15 to 18,000 people. But the fact is, people subconsciously or consciously are worried about it coming to get you. Marburg or Ebola could come here. And, again, you don't want to be alarmist, but dengue's coming into Florida, it's coming to Texas, it's coming into Greece, it's coming into Spain, into California. And if we don't get our act together and figure out how to mitigate this, it's really going to be a burden on our health systems. And we certainly see it in highland Nepal in our cohorts, and we're really worried about it because if somebody has kidney disease already, dengue is known to, there's very little understanding, but we do know that it does affect the kidney. So, it's a balance of not being accused of being over the top, but at the same time, if you want those with the power to put the development funding into practice, the research funding into practice, it's coming for you.
I think another important thing to add to that is that you could have malaria get worse in one place and better somewhere else, but that's not a wash, because when people are exposed to malaria for the first time, it's much worse than when they're exposed for the 10th time in their lifetime. And communities that don't have a history dealing with malaria and don't have a public health infrastructure that's there are going to suffer much more than the incremental benefit that the communities might receive that are seeing the decrease. So, I think it's like you're saying, you don't want to be alarmist, but I think change is usually not a good thing when it comes to infectious disease.
But I think the data supports it. You don't want to go outside the data. The data supports that it's going to go further north and south. It's going to be more of a burden in other places. And I think, you're sounding the alarm, not being alarmist, based on the data.
Vaishnavi, I want to go back to you and some of the mitigation strategies you were describing. You mentioned, not in your talk, but in the article in Science, well, you mentioned in your talk that you could get like 1 degree of improvement from the white reflective paint, wasn't it? And but another place in that article said that you could get 4.5 degrees of improvement with more expensive roof mitigation strategies. Can you talk about what any of those are, or if are they just too out of reach for the urban poor anywhere to really be talking about, do we need to be much more low budget and practical?
Yeah, so the 1 degree, at least 1 degree, the studies have shown at least 1 degree improvement with the solar paint. I think a little bit depends on, the individual house and the design of the individual house and the environment itself. As I think the interventions that show a much higher degree of difference are much more expensive. And they have to do with just different construction materials and roofing. And so a lot more work needs to be done in order to make that accessible for low-income groups, I would say. Even in higher income groups, it's still a very sort of nascent kind of development. They've just started looking at these different kinds of roofing materials and how those could help. So yeah, I mean, there's just not enough work that's been done to bring those into play yet. The solar reflective paint is the most common right now, and that's because it's very easy and it's relatively accessible. It's still even the paint is expensive for very low income families, and so a lot of the projects that you see have been funded from outside, so that the families themselves are not spending that money. And one question is, can they in the future sustain that? Because that paint will need to be renewed at some point. And is it financially sustainable for some of the low-income families to actually be able to do that themselves? I mean, it's not just regular paint that you can just buy off the street.
I was also intrigued by the 300-year-old house and how our forebears seem to have, your forebears, whoever's, seem to have a much better take on practical architecture for battling heat. Is that because this place was a mansion and they could afford to do it, or are some of its tricks keeping the heat out things that could be more generally implemented?
Yeah, I mean, it was a mansion. I think that house was what would have been the local governor right under the king, and so it was, exceptionally beautiful and well built. But a lot of the principles, the features that you see in that house, you do see in more modest homes as well. The inner courtyard, the thick external walls, the small windows, all of these go towards kind of preventing heat from entering the house, but also increasing airflow. And you do see some of those features, not to this extent that you would see in such a great house, in more modest homes. There has been, of course, these practices have been sort of lost in urbanization because in a mid-rise, in these dense urban localities where you have mid-rises and you have high-rises, these design features don't even come into play, and they don't need to if you're using air conditioning or you have electric fans and things like that. But some architects are looking at sort of trying to take lessons from these traditional designs and how can we use that for passive cooling in modern buildings. And in fact, there are these new building codes that have come into play in the last few years, federal building codes, not codes exactly, more like guidelines, which were kind of created with the help of architects and independent experts. And there are some principles of traditional design that have been used for passive cooling in that, and to do with ventilation essentially, and how to increase ventilation in these homes. The problem is that these codes aren't India is a federalist structure, and so states have to adopt these codes and mandate them, and that hasn't happened yet. And so in many places it'll be sort of where cities are sort of developing really rapidly, some of them won't get the benefit of these codes.
Right, right. I'm watching the clock with alarm and realizing that we have fewer than 4 minutes left. What I'd like to do with that last bit of time is to ask each of you in a sort of a lightning round of like 45 seconds or less answer, tell us one thing that gives you have a choice, either one thing that gives you hope in your work or one thing that we should all be doing to mitigate some of these really serious problems that we're discussing here. So why don't we go in reverse order? Vaishnavi, can you offer something? I didn't give you much time to think, I know.
One thing, well, I mean, one thing that gives me hope is that even though, it hasn't paid much attention to heat, it's only recently that we've been looking at heat waves. And I think that comes from the fact that we sort of take it for granted. We take the heat for granted. And so the government sort of come relatively late to kind of looking at this compared to, say, other hazards like cyclones or floods. But, as you saw in some of the photos in that presentation, there are some researchers as well as environmental and citizens groups that are really pushing to change that and to look more closely and more scientifically at mitigation and action. And that is hope.
Great. Anna, how about you?
I think I see hope in the beginnings of discussions around moving towards a circular economy and considering taking into account the full expanse of products and services, including like the full life cycle. So for example, like, not only thinking about the item that you can buy off the shelf, but also where it comes from and where the waste is going. And so I feel like if we can start changing our mentality towards that way of viewing the world, we will have more respect for our environment and we will care more for the environment. And then hopefully the changes will come in place that then need to help protect the planet and protect the people.
For sure. Adelaide.
Yeah, okay, so where I see hope is the fact that there seems to be political will, the fact that most of the countries have signed to Paris Accord. It's really encouraging to see that. I think that's a big step forward. But I also don't see hope the fact that in global health, people are still traveling a lot and contributing to carbon emission. And I think that's something we need to proactively address. Yeah.
Erin.
I think the thing that has given me the most hope recently is the knowledge that in the last 5 years, there have been some really major breakthroughs in legal scholarship, historical scholarship, and attribution science that have really, I think, are going to enable us to turn the tide on being able to hold fossil fuel companies and other polluters responsible, financially mainly, for the harms that are caused by climate change. Because we have new legal strategies available, we have new information now about when they knew and what they know about climate change and the fact that they were responsible for it. And some of the science like we and others are doing to try to attribute what are the harms that are caused by climate change, that can be used in a court of law to hold companies accountable. And so that gives me a little bit of hope that there are strategies in addition to the other policy and legal strategies that might be used to start to move the needle on climate change in a similar way to what was done with the tobacco litigation in the 1990s.
Right. Jason.
First, we need to put you in touch with Terry Collingsworth, who does amazing work holding companies to accountable and maybe one of the only lawyers who's really successful at it. Yeah, so I think for me, I've been lucky enough. I have a baby face, but I'm not that young. I've been lucky enough to live long enough to see the change I wanted to enact start to take shape. Funding's opened up. We're no longer on the vanguard. We've moved into a steady state as an organization. Like, we're funded by Department of Labor, state, NSF, UK Research Council. These things were unimaginable. So, and it's not just us. We've been like part of the tip of the spear. Adelaide and her team have, I mean, Anna, colleagues have like pushed everything forward and made this to be a very normal thing to talk about. So I think seeing that change start to take shape, seeing the change in the behavior of companies that were once so abusive is really encouraging. And the last one is the true coordination and collaboration and kind of pre-competitive attitude. And one thing I wanted to mention about that to Vaishnavi is I work with like big industry, but most people with that risk factor for heat strain at work are in small, medium enterprises. And my colleague in Tamil Nadu, in Chennai at Sri Ramachandra, Vidya Venugopal, just had her work covered by BBC, improving the working conditions of salt pan workers and brick kiln workers in those small, medium enterprises. So it's incredible to see how we're sharing that information, using best practices, and moving forward in a really short amount of time.
Thank you, and can we give a big round of applause to all the panelists, near and far.
Wonderful. Thank you to the panel. That concludes our plenary for the evening. I hope you all are able to join some of the many social events that are happening this evening. They're listed in the meeting program in the app. And then we'll see you back here tomorrow for the next plenary. Thank you all. Have a good night.